Looking down at my father's casket, surrounded by 200 mourners dressed in black, my older brother Marcus leaned in close and whispered just loud enough for our front row to hear, "Face it, David. You're still the same failure you've always been. Dad knew it, I know it, and deep down, so do you." The family members nearby shifted uncomfortably, pretending they hadn't heard. But then the family lawyer stood up with Dad's will, cleared his throat, and what he read next made my brother's face go white as the lilies on the coffin. Yeah, that really happened. Let me take you back to the day that changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my father, and myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of October 15th started like any other funeral day. Gray skies, the smell of rain in the air, and that heavy feeling in your chest that comes when you're about to say goodbye to someone forever. But this wasn't just any funeral. This was my father's funeral, and I knew it would be complicated. My father, Robert Chen, was a man who built an empire from nothing, who commanded respect wherever he went, and who had 2 sons who couldn't have been more different if we'd tried. I'm David Chen, 34 years old, the younger son who never quite measured up. At least, that's what everyone thought. While my brother Marcus followed the traditional path, Harvard MBA, corporate, ladder climbing, expensive suits, and a corner office managing Dad's construction company, I took a different route. After college, I became a social worker. Not exactly the career path that impresses at country club dinners or family gatherings. For 15 years, I worked in the trenches. I helped homeless veterans find housing, got kids out of dangerous situations, connected families with resources they desperately needed. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, lived in a modest apartment, and wore the same 3 suits to every formal occasion. To most people, including my own family, I looked like I was barely scraping by. The truth was more complicated, but nobody bothered to ask. Marcus, on the other hand, was everything Dad seemed to want in a son. At 38, he had the corner office, the BMW, the $1 million house in the suburbs, and a wife who looked like she stepped out of a magazine. He spoke the language Dad understood: profit margins, quarterly reports, market expansions. When Dad talked business, Marcus was right there with spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. When Dad talked about legacy, Marcus was already planning the next generation of Chen construction projects. Me? I was the son who showed up to family dinners and listened to conversations about investments and real estate deals, while everyone politely asked how my little job helping people was going. Dad would nod along when I talked about the families I'd helped, but I could see it in his eyes, the disappointment, the question of where he'd gone wrong with his younger son. The funeral was held at St. Mark's Cathedral, the same church where Dad had married Mom 35 years ago. Mom passed away 5 years earlier, and Dad never quite recovered. The church was packed with people from every corner of Dad's life: business associates, construction workers, neighbors, family friends, and distant relatives who only showed up for major life events. I arrived early with my girlfriend Sarah, a teacher I'd been dating for 2 years. She squeezed my hand as we walked through the heavy oak doors. "You okay?" she asked, knowing this day would be difficult for reasons that went beyond typical grief. I nodded, though we both knew I wasn't really okay. How could I be, knowing that this day would probably include the final confirmation that I'd been the disappointment son? Marcus was already there, of course, commanding attention in his perfectly tailored black suit, directing people to their seats like he was running a board meeting. His wife Jennifer stood beside him, offering condolences with the practiced grace of someone who'd perfected the art of social interactions. Their 2 kids, 8 and 10, stood quietly beside them in their matching outfits, looking like a picture from a family catalog. "David," Marcus said when he saw me, his voice carrying that tone he'd perfected over the years. Not quite warm, not quite cold, but definitely measuring. Glad you could make it. It was such a Marcus thing to say, as if I might not show up to my own father's funeral. As if my being there was some kind of favor, rather than the most natural thing in the world. I bit back my response and simply nodded. Of course I'm here, Marcus. The service itself was beautiful, in the way that expensive funerals always are. The flowers were perfect, the music was moving, and the eulogies painted Dad as the successful businessman and family man he'd worked his whole life to become. Marcus spoke first, delivering a polished speech about Dad's vision, his business acumen, and his dedication to building something lasting for future generations. When it was my turn, I talked about a different side of Dad, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who came to my little league games even when work was crazy, who quietly donated to local charities and helped employees through tough times. I talked about the values he instilled in me about helping others, about the importance of making a difference beyond just making money. I could see Marcus's jaw tighten as I spoke. In his mind, I was probably romanticizing Dad, making him sound softer than the tough businessman everyone knew. But I was talking about the father I knew, the one who had shaped my decisions even if he'd never understood them. After the service, we all moved to the cemetery. The October air was crisp, and the leaves on the trees around the burial site had turned brilliant shades of orange and red. It should have been peaceful, beautiful even, but tension hung over our family section like storm clouds. That's when it happened. As we stood around the grave, watching Dad's casket being lowered into the ground, I felt the weight of 15 years of family expectations, of being the son who chose purpose over profit, of being misunderstood by the man whose approval I'd always wanted but never quite achieved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was lost in my own thoughts, thinking about all the conversations Dad and I never had. All the ways I wished I could have made him understand that success meant different things to different people, that helping a homeless veteran find permanent housing felt just as important as closing $1 million construction deal, that the thank you letters from families I'd helped meant just as much as quarterly profit reports. Marcus stepped closer, his voice low but clearly audible to several family members. You know, David, I've been thinking. Dad spent his whole life building something real, something lasting. And then, there's you. I looked at him, not sure where this was going, but knowing from experience that wherever it was headed, I wouldn't like it. All these years, he continued, Dad kept hoping you'd grow up, maybe join the company, contribute something meaningful to the family legacy. Instead, you're 34 years old, making $40,000 a year as a social worker, driving that beat-up Honda, still renting an apartment like you're fresh out of college. I felt Sarah tense beside me. Several cousins and aunts pretended to look elsewhere, but I knew they were listening to every word. Marcus, this really isn't the time or place, I started, but he wasn't finished. Face it, David, you're still the same failure you've always been. Dad knew it, I know it, and deep down, so do you. Here we are, burying a man who built an empire, and his younger son has nothing to show for his life except a job that any recent college graduate could do. The words hit like physical blows, not because they were particularly clever or cutting, but because they voiced every insecurity I'd carried for years. Every time Dad looked puzzled when I talked about my work. Every family gathering where Marcus's achievements were celebrated while my career was politely acknowledged and quickly moved past. I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself, to point out that success couldn't be measured purely in dollars and square footage. But before I could speak, something unexpected happened. James Morrison, Dad's lawyer for the past 20 years, approached our group. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, always impeccably dressed, carrying himself with the quiet authority that comes from handling important family matters. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said quietly. But, as you know, your father requested that the will be read immediately following the burial service. If the immediate family could gather at the church hall, we can take care of this matter. Marcus nodded efficiently, ever the businessman. Of course, James. We can handle this. Quickly and efficiently. I dreaded this moment almost as much as the funeral itself. I knew what the will would contain. Marcus would inherit the construction company, probably the majority of Dad's personal wealth, and the family house. I'd probably receive some nominal amount, maybe a small property. Enough to be polite, but not enough to suggest Dad saw me as an equal successor. As we walked back toward the church hall, Marcus fell into step beside me again. His earlier words were still echoing in my head. Failure. Nothing to show for his life. Dad knew it. Don't take what I said personally, David, he said, though his tone suggested he meant every word. I just think it's time someone was honest with you about your choices. Dad was too polite to say it, but he was disappointed. He'd hoped you'd make something of yourself. I wanted to argue, wanted to defend my career, my choices, my life. But the truth was, a part of me wondered if Marcus was right. Maybe I had wasted my potential. Maybe Dad really had been disappointed in me all along. The church hall was set up simply, with chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a small table where James had laid out the will and related documents. Besides Marcus and me, the group included Jennifer, our Aunt Helen, Dad's sister, and Uncle Ray, Mom's brother, along with a few other close relatives. James waited until everyone was seated before beginning. Robert Chen was a meticulous man, he said, particularly when it came to his final wishes. This will was updated as recently as 3 weeks ago, so it reflects his most current intentions. 3 weeks ago, Dad had been in the hospital then, weak but still mentally sharp. I remembered visiting him, sitting by his bedside while he dozed, wondering what he thought about as he faced the end of his life. Before I begin with the specific bequests, James continued, Robert asked me to read a letter he wrote which provides context for his decisions. He pulled out a sealed envelope, opened it carefully, and began to read in Dad's own words. To my sons, Marcus and David, if you're hearing this, I'm gone, and I hope I've left this world knowing I've been a good father to both of you. You're both my sons, both my pride, though I know I haven't always been good at showing it. Marcus, you've followed the path I understood. You've taken to business naturally, and I'm proud of the man you've become. You'll find that you're well provided for in this will, as I know you'll continue to grow what we've built together. David, my younger son, I owe you an apology. For too many years, I measured success by the wrong standards. I looked at your bank account instead of the lives you've touched. I counted your salary instead of counting the families you've saved. I measured your achievements against corporate benchmarks instead of human impact. I want everyone here to understand something about David that I should have said out loud years ago. James paused, looked directly at me, then continued reading. 3 months ago, I received a letter. Actually, I've received dozens of them over the years, but this one made me finally understand what kind of man my younger son has become. It was from Maria Santos, a woman David helped 5 years ago. She was a single mother with 3 children, fleeing an abusive relationship. David didn't just help her find housing. He connected her with job training, helped her kids get into better schools, checked on the family regularly for months. Maria wrote to tell me that she'd just graduated nursing school and bought her first house. She wanted me to know that none of it would have been possible without David's help. She called him her guardian angel and said he'd given her family a future. It wasn't the first letter like that I'd received about David. There was the veteran who went from sleeping under bridges to managing a nonprofit shelter. The teenager who went from the foster system to college because David fought for him. The elderly woman who kept her home because David helped her navigate Medicare fraud. I realized I'd been so focused on the business David didn't build that I'd completely missed the lives he'd rebuilt. The room was completely silent. I felt something shift inside my chest, like a lock turning. James continued with Dad's letter. David, son, you chose purpose over profit. And that's not failure. That's character. You chose to measure success by the lives you've improved rather than the money you've made. And I should have celebrated that choice instead of questioning it. I've learned that David has been living modestly not because he couldn't afford better, but because he's been sending 15% of his salary to support 3 different families he's helped over the years. He drives an old car because he gave his savings to help a family avoid foreclosure. He lives in a small apartment because he uses his bonus money to fund a scholarship for kids aging out of foster care. This isn't failure. This is heroism that we were too blind to recognize. My throat felt tight. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand so hard it almost hurt. James looked up from the letter. The will itself reflects Robert's understanding of his son's true characters and future needs. He set the letter aside and picked up the will. To my son Marcus Chen, who has devoted himself to continuing the family business, I leave Chen Construction in its entirety, along with the family house and 40% of my liquid assets. I trust he will continue to grow what we've built, together. To my son, David Chen, whose work has always been about building communities rather than buildings, I leave 60% of my liquid assets, approximately $2 million, to continue his mission of helping others. Additionally, I leave him the foundation I've been quietly funding for the past 2 years, the Chen Family Foundation for Social Services, which currently has assets of $8 million and was created specifically to support David's type of work. Also to David, I leave my cabin in Vermont, where I've seen him find the most peace, and my collection of vintage cars, knowing he'll appreciate their craftsmanship even if he prefers his practical Honda. The numbers hit the room like thunder. Marcus had inherited the family business, which was valuable, but I had inherited the larger share of Dad's personal wealth, plus a foundation designed to amplify the work I'd already been doing. James wasn't finished. There's one final note from your father. Marcus, the business needs someone who understands profit margins and market strategy. You're exactly the right person for that role. David, the world needs people who understand human margins and life strategy. You're exactly the right person for that role. I wish I'd understood sooner that both kinds of building matter equally, and the silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. I looked at Marcus, whose face had gone through several color changes during the reading. The smugness from the cemetery had completely disappeared, replaced by something I'd never seen before: uncertainty. I don't understand, Marcus finally said. The foundation? When did Dad? James nodded patiently. Your father established the foundation 18 months ago. He'd been following David's work for years, collecting the letters from people he'd helped, tracking the outcomes of his interventions. Robert was quite proud of David's impact, though he admitted he'd done a poor job of expressing it. I sat there trying to process everything. The money was shocking enough, but it wasn't really about the money. It was about the recognition, the understanding, the validation that my father had seen value in my choices even when I thought he disapproved. David, Jennifer spoke up, her voice carefully measured. Does this mean you've been hiding money? Living like you don't have any? Sarah squeezed my hand again, and I finally found my voice. I haven't been hiding anything. Until 5 minutes ago, I had about $8,000 in my savings account and a 401k that I've been contributing to since I started working. I've been living within my social worker's salary because that's all I had. Marcus was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. But Dad said you've been supporting other families, giving away your bonuses. Because I chose to, I said quietly. Because that felt more important than buying new clothes or moving to a bigger apartment. Because when you see a single mother about to lose her home, Your own comfort starts to feel less important. The room fell quiet again as everyone processed what had just happened. Marcus, who had spent 15 years seeing himself as the successful son and me as the disappointment, was now confronting the reality that Dad had valued us both, just in different ways. More importantly, Dad had seen something in my choices that I hadn't even seen myself. He'd recognized that my modest lifestyle wasn't a sign of failure, but a reflection of different priorities, that the impact I'd made couldn't be measured in conventional terms, but was no less valuable. As people began to file out of the hall, Marcus approached me cautiously. The brother who had called me a failure an hour earlier now looked unsure of everything he thought he knew. "David, he started, then stopped. "I owe you an apology. A big one." I looked at him, seeing my older brother for maybe the first time in years. Not the successful businessman who seemed to have everything figured out, but a man who'd just learned that his understanding of success and failure might have been incomplete. "We both measured success the way we thought Dad wanted us to," I said. But it turns out he was measuring it differently than either of us realized. As Sarah and I walked out of the church hall together, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 15 years of family gatherings: genuine pride in my choices, validated not just by the money Dad had left me, but by the understanding he'd finally expressed. The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in thought. Finally, Sarah spoke up. "How does it feel?" I considered the question carefully. "Surreal," I admitted. For so long I thought I was disappointing him. I thought he saw my career as a waste of potential. And now I realize he saw the potential all along. He was just looking at it from a different angle than I thought. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, the one that had seemed so modest compared to Marcus's house, and thought about the unexpected turn my life had just taken. The money would allow me to help more people, to expand my impact in ways I'd only dreamed of. But more than that, the knowledge that Dad had understood and valued my choices gave me a sense of peace I hadn't realized I was missing. I thought about all the people I'd helped over the years, all the letters Dad had apparently collected, all the lives that had been changed in small but meaningful ways. I thought about Maria Santos and her nursing degree, about the veteran now, running his own shelter, about the teenager who'd made it to college against all odds. Marcus had called me a failure, and for a moment, standing at our father's grave, I'd almost believed him. But failures don't receive letters from the people whose lives they've transformed. Failures don't inspire foundations designed to amplify their impact. As I finally began to understand what Dad had realized before the rest of us, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: complete confidence in the path I'd chosen, and excitement for where that path might lead next, especially now with resources to make an even bigger difference. The day had started with humiliation and ended with validation, but more than that, it had ended with understanding of myself, my father, and the different ways people can build meaningful lives. The days following Dad's funeral felt like living in someone else's life. The man who'd been called a failure by his own brother was now sitting in a lawyer's office, learning about investment portfolios and foundation boards. James Morrison had asked me to come in to discuss the practical aspects of my inheritance, and I found myself in the surreal position of planning how to responsibly manage $2 million. The foundation has been operating quietly for 18 months, James explained, spreading documents across his mahogany desk. Your father was very particular about its structure. He wanted it to be able to respond quickly to individual crises, not just fund large institutional programs. I stared at the foundation charter, written in Dad's handwriting in the margins. The Chen Family Foundation for Social Services. It even had my name on it as the designated director. Dad had been planning this for nearly 2 years, watching my work, documenting its impact, preparing for this transition. There's something else, James said, pulling out a folder thick with papers. Your father kept detailed records of the families you've helped, not just the letters that people sent him, but his own research into their outcomes. David, he was tracking the ripple effects of your work. He opened the folder, and I saw pages of notes in Dad's careful handwriting. Maria Santos and her family. Nursing degree, house purchase, 2 kids in honors programs. James Thompson, the veteran, clean for 6 years, managing a shelter that's housed 200-plus people. The Hendersons, the family I'd helped avoid foreclosure, daughter just got a full scholarship to medical school. Your father calculated, James said with a slight smile, that your direct interventions have positively impacted over 400 individuals, which has had downstream effects on their families, their communities, their workplaces. He estimated that the collective economic impact of your work, people staying in homes, getting employed, starting businesses, their children succeeding academically, runs into the millions. I felt overwhelmed. He never said anything to me about tracking this. He wanted to surprise you. But David, there's more. He also documented how your approach differs from traditional social services. The personal investment, the long-term check-ins, the creative problem-solving. He believed your model could be scaled, replicated, taught to others. The weight of this revelation settled on me like a warm blanket. Dad hadn't just understood my work. He'd seen it as something bigger, something that could grow beyond just me helping one person at a time. Walking out of James's office that afternoon, I drove straight to the community center where I'd worked for 15 years. The building was old, underfunded, but it had been my second home. My supervisor, Carol Washington, a woman who'd been fighting the good fight for 25 years, looked up as I entered her office. David, how are you holding up after everything? I sat down across from her, still processing the morning's meeting. Carol, what would you do if someone handed you the resources to take everything we do here and expand it 100-fold? She leaned back in her chair, studying my face. That's a very specific hypothetical question. I told her about the foundation, about Dad's observations, about the opportunity that had just landed in my lap. Carol listened without interrupting, her expression growing more amazed by the minute. Your father was tracking success metrics on your cases? She asked finally. David, do you realize how unprecedented that is? Most social workers never get to see the long-term outcomes of their interventions. We help someone through a crisis and hope for the best, but we rarely get to follow up years later. I always followed up, I said. I couldn't help it. I needed to know they were okay. Exactly. And that's what made the difference. Carol stood up and walked to her filing cabinet. David, I've been in this field for 1/4 of a century. I've seen social workers burn out, move on, treat this like stepping stones to other careers, but you've treated every case like it mattered personally to you. She pulled out a file. Remember the Rodriguez family? The ones you helped 3 years ago when the father was laid off and they were facing eviction? I nodded. Miguel and Rosa, 3 kids. Miguel just opened his own landscaping business. He's employing 6 people now, all former clients of community organizations. Rosa finished her GED and is working toward becoming a teacher's aide. Their oldest daughter is studying engineering on a scholarship. I didn't know about the business, I said, surprised. Because you don't take credit, you just keep moving forward to the next person who needs help. But David? That family? They sponsor a Little League team now. Miguel mentors other unemployed men in the community. Rosa volunteers at a literacy program. The ripple effects of your intervention are still spreading 3 years later. I sat back, thinking about all the families I'd worked with, wondering how many had similar stories I didn't know about. The foundation, Carol continued, sounds like your father understood something that even you haven't fully grasped yet. You haven't just been helping individuals. You've been investing in communities. That evening, Sarah and I went for dinner. At our usual spot, a small Italian restaurant where the owner, Tony, always remembered our names and asked about our work. As we settled into our booth, I found myself looking around the place with new eyes. "Remember when Tony was having trouble with his lease 2 years ago?" I asked Sarah. She nodded. "You helped him navigate the legal issues with his landlord. I ran into his daughter at the market last week. She's graduated law school and is working for a firm that specializes in helping small business owners with exactly those kinds of problems. She said watching what happened with her dad's restaurant inspired her career choice." Sarah smiled. "Another ripple effect?" "Yeah, and I'm starting to see them everywhere now. It's like Dad opened my eyes to something I was too close to see myself." As we talked, I began to share some of the ideas that had been forming since my meeting with James. The foundation could develop a program to train other social workers in long-term engagement techniques. We could create a database to track outcomes and identify best practices. We could fund micro-interventions for families at critical moments, preventing larger crises. "There's something else I want to do," I said, feeling the excitement build as I spoke. "I want to create a scholarship program for kids from families we've helped. Not just college scholarships, but trade school, certification programs, whatever path they want to pursue." Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. "Your father would be proud." The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose. That felt different from anything I'd experienced before. I'd always been driven to help people, but now I could see the possibility of systemic change, of creating lasting impact beyond individual cases. I called Marcus. "David?" He sounded surprised to hear from me. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing well. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something. Do you have some time this week to get together?" "Of course. Actually, I've been wanting to talk to you too." We met at a coffee shop near his office, a place I'd never been before because it was in the business district where I rarely had reason to go. Marcus arrived looking less polished than usual, his tie slightly loosened, his hair not quite perfectly styled. "David, before you say anything, I need to apologize," he began immediately. "What I said at the cemetery, that was inexcusable. I've been thinking about it nonstop since the will reading." I held up a hand. "Marcus, we both operated under false assumptions. You thought success looked one way. I thought Dad valued things a certain way. We were both partly right and partly wrong." He nodded slowly. "I've been going through some of Dad's things in his office. Did you know he had a file just labeled David's work? It's full of newspaper clippings about community programs, research on social services effectiveness, articles about innovative approaches to helping families."
This surprised me. I had no idea. He was studying your field, David, learning about it, trying to understand what you were doing and why it mattered. I found notes where he'd calculated the cost-effectiveness of various social interventions versus traditional charity donations. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of a handwritten note from Dad. David's approach: $500 intervention prevents $50,000 crisis. Traditional charity: $50,000 donation addresses crisis after it happens. David's way prevents problems. Traditional way fixes them. Prevention is innovation. He got it, I said quietly. He understood what I was trying to do. And I didn't, Marcus admitted. I saw your small apartment and old car and thought you were failing at life. I didn't see that you were choosing to live modestly so you could help others. We sat in silence for a moment, both processing years of misunderstanding. "Marcus, there's something I want to propose," I said finally. "The foundation Dad left me, it's incredible, but it could be even more powerful with the right partnerships." He looked interested. "What do you mean?" "What if Chen Construction partnered with the foundation on community development projects? Not just building houses, but building communities, affordable housing combined with social services, job training programs, educational opportunities." Marcus's eyes lit up with a spark I hadn't seen since we were kids. "You're talking about integrated community development." "Exactly. Your business expertise, my social services background, Dad's resources. We could create something that lasts, that grows, that helps entire neighborhoods thrive." "David, that's brilliant. And it honors both sides of what Dad valued, business success and social impact." We spent the next 2 hours brainstorming. Marcus had ideas about sustainable building practices, creating affordable housing that would actually stay affordable. Long term, I had ideas about wraparound services, community centers, programs that would grow with the neighborhoods. "There's something else," Marcus said as we were getting ready to leave. "I never told you this, but Dad used to brag about you." I looked at him skeptically. "Really?" "Really. At business events, when people asked about his kids, he'd talk about how I was growing the company, and then he'd talk about how you were changing lives. He'd tell stories about families you'd helped, kids you'd mentored. I always thought he was just being polite, but now I realize he was genuinely proud." "Why didn't he tell me?" Marcus smiled sadly. "Why didn't I tell you that I was actually jealous of the work you were doing? We're not great at talking about feelings in this family, David, but Dad's actions spoke louder than his words." Driving home from that conversation, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Dad. Got sick hope. Not just hope for the people I could help with the foundation, but hope for my family, for the relationships I thought were irreparable. That weekend, Sarah and I drove up to Vermont to see the cabin Dad had left me. I'd only been there a few times over the years, usually for brief family gatherings. It was a simple place, built by Dad's own hands in the 1980s, nestled in the woods overlooking a small lake. As we walked through the cabin, I found evidence everywhere of Dad's hidden understanding of my work. Books on social policy lined the shelves. There were framed copies of the thank you letters he'd mentioned in his will. On his desk, I found a half-finished letter to me that he'd apparently never sent. "Dear David," it began, "I need you to know that your mother and I were never disappointed in your choice to become a social worker. We were disappointed in ourselves for not better supporting that choice. You saw problems that needed solving and dedicated your life to solving them. That takes the same kind of vision and determination that builds businesses, just applied to different challenges." The letter went on to detail specific cases I'd worked on, describing the outcomes and analyzing what had made the difference. It ended with, "I hope someday to tell you in person how proud I am of the man you've become. You chose purpose over profit, and that's not failure, that's wisdom." Sarah found me sitting on the porch, holding the unfinished letter, tears running down my face. "He knew," I said. "All along he knew." That evening, we built a fire in the stone fireplace and talked about the future, about the foundation, about the partnership with Marcus, about the possibility of expanding beyond individual social work to community transformation. "You know what this means, don't you?" Sarah said, curled up beside me on the couch. "What?" "This story isn't really about the money your dad left you. It's about the validation he gave you. The recognition that your approach to helping people wasn't just effective, it was innovative. She was right. The money would allow me to do more, to help more people, to create lasting programs. But the real gift was the understanding, the knowledge that Dad had seen value in my choices all along. The following Monday, I submitted my resignation at the community center. Carol understood immediately. "Time to scale up," she said with a smile. "Time to scale up," I agreed. As I cleaned out my office, I thought about all the people I'd worked with from this small room. The families in crisis who'd sat across from my desk, the kids who'd come by after school to talk, the senior citizens who'd needed help navigating bureaucracy. Each case had taught me something. Each family had shown me a different aspect of resilience. Each success had been a small victory against systems that too often failed the people who needed them most. But now, instead of helping one family at a time, I could help create systems that prevented families from falling into crisis in the first place. Instead of fighting individual battles against bureaucracy, I could help design better, more responsive social services. Marcus called that afternoon. David, I've been talking to my team about the community development idea. We want to propose a pilot project. What if we bought a struggling neighborhood and developed it as an integrated community? Housing, services, jobs, education, everything coordinated from the ground up. Which neighborhood were you thinking about? The area around Lincoln Elementary. You know it well. You've placed a lot of families in that area over the years. I did know it well. It was a neighborhood that had been struggling for decades, with high poverty rates, limited resources, but strong community ties. The families, they weren't looking for handouts. They were looking for opportunities. Marcus, that's perfect. The community is already there, just under-resourced. If we could provide stable housing, job training, childcare, after-school programs, all coordinated together instead of scattered across different agencies. Exactly. And David, the team at Chen Construction is excited about this. They've been building the same kind of projects for years. This would be something different, something meaningful. As we spoke, I realized something that took my breath away. Dad hadn't just understood my work. He'd seen how it could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. He'd left me the resources to prove that social work could be more than crisis intervention. It could be community building on a massive scale. That evening I sat down and wrote my own letter, not to Dad, but to all the people who'd ever made me feel like choosing purpose over profit was somehow settling for less. I wrote about Maria Santos, now a nurse whose children were thriving in school, about James Thompson, the veteran whose shelter had become a model for other cities, about the Rodriguez family, whose success was spawning more success throughout their neighborhood. I wrote about the ripple effects of investing in people, about the compound interest of human potential, about the exponential returns of treating people's problems as solvable rather than inevitable. But mostly, I wrote about the validation of knowing that sometimes the path that looks like failure to others is actually the path to the most profound success of all. Success measured not in dollars accumulated, but in lives transformed. As I finished writing, I thought about Marcus calling me a failure at Dad's funeral. In that moment, surrounded by the evidence of everything I'd accomplished, every life I'd touched, every community I'd helped stabilize, I felt nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for the brother who'd challenged me to prove my worth, for the father who'd seen my value even when I couldn't see it myself, and for the work that had never felt like failure to me, even when it looked that way to everyone else. The foundation would allow me to do more than I'd ever dreamed. But the real inheritance from Dad wasn't the money. It was the understanding that success comes in many forms, that building lives is just as valuable as building buildings, and that sometimes the greatest impact comes from the humblest beginnings. Marcus had called me a failure, but Dad's will revealed the truth. I hadn't failed at anything. I'd simply been succeeding at something different than what my family had been measuring. And now, with resources to match my mission, the real work could begin. 6 months after Dad's funeral, the transformation had begun. Not just in the Lincoln neighborhood where our pilot community project was taking shape, but in my own understanding of what scale really meant. What started as individual social work had evolved into something unprecedented, a comprehensive approach to community building that was attracting attention from urban planners, policymakers, and social innovators across the country.
The Chen Community Center, the first building completed in our integrated development, stood as a testament to what happened when social services met forward-thinking construction. The building itself was beautiful, with solar panels. Marcus, had insisted on, community gardens designed by the residents, and flexible spaces that could serve as everything from job training centers to neighborhood celebration halls. But it was what happened inside those walls that truly mattered. Maria Santos, the woman Dad had written about in his letter, now worked there as a community health coordinator. She'd approached me 3 months after we broke ground, asking if there were ways she could give back to an initiative that seemed to understand what families really needed. "David," she'd said, "you helped me when I had nowhere else to turn. Now I want to help other families who are where I was 5 years ago." Maria wasn't alone. James Thompson, the veteran whose life had turned around after our intervention years ago, had partnered with us to create a job training program specifically for other veterans struggling with housing instability. He'd designed the curriculum himself, focusing not just on skills training but on the emotional resilience needed to rebuild a life after trauma. "The difference with this place," James explained to a documentary crew that had come to film our project, "is that they don't see you as a problem to be fixed. They see you as a person with potential that just needs the right support to flourish." The ripple effects Dad had documented were accelerating. The Rodriguez family's landscaping business was now the primary contractor for maintaining all the green spaces in our development. Their eldest daughter, Sophia, had finished her engineering degree and was working with Marcus's team on sustainable building designs for the second phase of construction. But perhaps the most profound change was in Marcus himself. The brother who had measured success purely in profit margins was discovering the satisfaction of profit with purpose. Chen Construction had won 3 awards for innovative community development, and Marcus found himself speaking at conferences about integrated social and economic planning. "David changed my definition of success," he told a room full of business leaders at a sustainability summit. "I spent years thinking he was failing because he wasn't maximizing his earning potential. I didn't understand that he was maximizing his impact potential instead." The foundation had grown beyond anything Dad could have imagined. We'd established partnerships with universities to research and document our community development model. The data we were collecting was unprecedented. Real-time tracking of how integrated services affected everything from high school graduation rates to local business creation to crime statistics. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, no relation to the family, I'd helped, a researcher from Columbia University who was leading our academic partnership, had become increasingly excited about what our data was revealing. "Traditional social services treat symptoms in isolation," she explained during one of our monthly research reviews. "Housing assistance here, job training there, childcare somewhere else. But the Chen model treats the whole ecosystem. The results are remarkable." The statistics were indeed remarkable. In the Lincoln neighborhood, high school graduation rates had increased by 35% in just 6 months. New business creation was up 120%. Most significantly, the number of families requiring emergency interventions had dropped by 60%, not because we weren't tracking them, but because the integrated support systems were preventing crises before they developed. But numbers, as compelling as they were, only told part of the story. The real story was in the individual transformations that were becoming everyday occurrences. There was Carmen Torres, a single mother who'd been working 3 part-time jobs just to keep her family afloat. Through our job training program, she'd been able to complete her nursing assistant certification while her children attended our after-school program. She now worked full-time at the community health clinic we'd established and had just bought her first house, one of the affordable units Marcus's team had designed specifically for community employees. "I used to think stability was a luxury I couldn't afford," Carmen told me during the community center's 6-month celebration. "Now I realize stability isn't a luxury, it's a foundation. And when you give people a foundation, they can build anything on top of it." There was Marcus Williams Jr., we'd laughed about the name coincidence, a teenager who'd been aging out of foster care when our program began. He'd not only finished high school, but had been accepted to 3 different colleges. More importantly, He'd become a mentor for younger kids in similar situations, helping them navigate the transition from dependence to independence. The difference here, Marcus Jr. explained to a group of visitors from another city interested in replicating our model, is that they don't just help you survive your circumstances, they help you transform them. The integrated approach was yielding unexpected benefits. The community garden had become not just a source of fresh food, but a place where elderly residents shared knowledge with young families, where different cultural groups exchanged traditions, where kids learned that vegetables didn't just come from supermarkets. Mrs. Chen, another name coincidence that always made people smile, an elderly Chinese woman who'd been isolated after her husband's death, had become the unofficial grandmother of the community. She taught traditional cooking classes in the community center kitchen, and her apartment had become a regular gathering place for neighbors who stopped by for advice, conversation, or just companionship. Community isn't something you build with bricks and mortar, she told me one afternoon as we walked through the neighborhood. It's something you build with relationships and trust. The success of the pilot project had attracted attention from an unexpected source: my former colleagues in traditional social services. Many were excited about the model, but some were skeptical about whether it could work outside of ideal conditions. Carol Washington, my former supervisor, visited regularly and had become one of our strongest advocates. But she also pushed us to think about scalability and sustainability. "This is wonderful, David," she said during one of her visits. "But how do you replicate this in communities that don't have a construction company attached to a foundation with millions of dollars in startup capital?" It was a fair question, and one that had led us to our next innovation, the Community Partnership Network. Instead of trying to replicate our exact model, we were developing toolkits that allowed other communities to adapt our integrated approach to their specific resources and needs. The network had grown to include partners in 12 cities, each testing different aspects of integrated community development. Detroit was focusing on combining urban agriculture with job training. Phoenix was integrating renewable energy projects with workforce development. Minneapolis was experimenting with cooperative business models alongside community services. Each partner site contributed data and insights back to the network, creating a collaborative research project that was yielding insights none of us could have developed alone. But the real validation of our approach came from an unexpected source. The Department of Housing and Urban Development had announced a new pilot program for integrated community development, and they'd asked us to help design the framework. "The Chen model represents a paradigm shift in how we think about community development," explained Dr. Patricia Williams, the HUD official leading the initiative. "Traditional approaches have been siloed: housing over here, employment services over there, education somewhere else. The Chen model proves that integration isn't just more efficient, it's more effective." The invitation to work with HUD represented an opportunity to scale our impact exponentially. But it also represented a challenge: how to maintain the personal, relationship-based approach that made our model work while operating at a national level. Sarah and I spent many evenings talking through the implications. She'd left her teaching job to become the Foundation's Director of Community Engagement, and her insights had been crucial to our success. "The danger of scaling," she pointed out one evening as we reviewed HUD's proposal, "is losing the very thing that makes this work: the personal connections, the individualized approach, the deep community relationships." She was right. Our model worked because we knew the people we were serving, because Maria Santos wasn't just a case file, but a neighbor whose children played with other community kids. Because James Thompson wasn't just a statistic, but a friend who stopped by the office to chat about his latest group of trainees. That's when I had the realization that would define the next phase of our work. We didn't need to scale the program itself. We needed to scale the people who could run programs like ours. The Chen Institute for Community Development was born from this insight. Instead of trying to manage community development projects across the country, we would train and support local social workers, community organizers, and development professionals to create integrated programs in their own communities. Our first cohort of 20 fellows came from cities across America, each committed to spending a year learning our model and then returning home to adapt it to their local contexts. They lived in the Lincoln neighborhood, worked alongside our team, and experienced firsthand how integrated services could transform communities. One of those fellows was Dr. Jennifer Kim, a social worker from Seattle, who'd been struggling with the limitations of traditional service delivery. In Seattle, I was helping families navigate 15 different agencies to get the services they needed, she explained during the fellows' final presentation. By the time they jumped through all the hoops, the crisis had often deepened. Here, I've learned that you don't have to accept that fragmentation as inevitable. Another fellow, Roberto Sanchez from Los Angeles, had been a community organizer frustrated by the gap between advocacy and actual service delivery. I could organize protests against inadequate housing all day long, he said. But here I've learned how to create the alternative, how to move from demanding change to building it yourself. The Fellows program was proving that our model could be adapted and scaled without losing its essential character. Each fellow was returning home with not just techniques and strategies, but with a fundamentally different understanding of what was possible when you treated community development as an integrated challenge rather than a series of separate problems. Marcus had become increasingly involved in the training program, particularly in helping fellows understand the construction and development side of community building. David taught me that business success and social impact aren't separate goals, he told the second cohort of fellows. They're the same goal approached from different angles. When communities thrive, businesses thrive. When people have stable housing and good jobs and quality education, everyone wins. The transformation in Marcus had been as remarkable as any of the individual success stories in our community. The brother who had once measured me against traditional markers of success was now pioneering new ways to measure business impact. Chen Construction now tracked metrics like employee retention, up 40% since implementing community-focused benefits, community economic impact. Every dollar spent on integrated development generated $320 in local economic activity, and what Marcus called legacy value, the long-term positive effects of their projects on neighborhoods and families. Dad would be amazed, Marcus told me one evening as we walked through the now bustling Lincoln neighborhood. He built buildings that lasted decades. We're building communities that will last generations. The evening walks through the community had become a regular tradition for us, a time to see firsthand how our work was playing out in real life. Children played in safe, well-designed playgrounds while parents chatted on porches. Small businesses thrived along the main street. People of different ages, backgrounds, and cultures moved through shared spaces with the easy familiarity of neighbors who knew and looked out for each other. "You know what I've learned?" I said to Marcus during one of these walks. Dad's letter said I chose purpose over profit, but that's not exactly right. I chose a different definition of profit. Marcus looked interested. How so? Profit doesn't have to mean money in your pocket. It can mean value created in the world. It can mean problems solved, lives improved, communities strengthened. When you measure profit that way, the work I've been doing, the work we've been doing together, has been incredibly profitable. The Chen model was attracting international attention as well. Delegations from cities in Canada, Europe, and Asia had visited to study our approach. The mayor of Copenhagen had spent a week shadowing our team, particularly interested in how we integrated environmental sustainability with social services. "What you've created here," she told me before leaving, "isn't just community development. It's a new form of urban governance, one that sees the health of individuals and the health of communities as inseparable." A team from Tokyo had been equally intrigued by our data tracking systems. "In Japan," explained Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, their lead researcher, "we have excellent infrastructure and services, but they exist in isolation from each other. Your model shows how connecting these services multiplies their effectiveness exponentially. The international interest led to the creation of the Global Community Development Alliance, a network of cities committed to testing integrated approaches to urban challenges. We hosted an annual summit at the University of Chicago, where practitioners from around the world shared innovations, challenges, and successes. At the most recent summit, a presentation from Medellin, Colombia, showed how they'd adapted our model to address the unique challenges of rapid urban migration by integrating housing development with skills training for rural migrants, job creation in emerging industries, and community-based conflict resolution. They'd transformed one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in South America into a model of innovation and opportunity. The Chen model taught us that the solution to urban poverty isn't just better services, explained Maria Elena Gomez, Medellin's Director of Social Innovation. It's better integration of services, better connection between economic development and human development, better understanding that a community's problems are interconnected, and so must be its solutions. These international adaptations were teaching us as much as we were teaching others. Each community's unique approach to integration was revealing new possibilities, new ways to connect services and support, new methods for measuring and sustaining impact. But perhaps the most significant development came from an unexpected source. The young people who'd grown up in our community were starting to graduate high school and make their own mark on the model. Sofia Rodriguez, whose parents I'd helped avoid foreclosure years ago, had not only completed her engineering degree, but had returned to the community with a revolutionary idea. She'd designed a mobile app that allowed residents to coordinate, shared resources, report maintenance issues, share skills, and organize community events. I grew up seeing how everything here is connected, she explained at the app's launch event. I wanted to create technology that supports that connection instead of replacing it. The app, called NeighborNet, was being beta tested in 5 of our partner communities. Initial results showed it was increasing community engagement by 40% and reducing response times for maintenance issues by 60%. Marcus Williams, Jr., the young man who'd aged out of foster care and was now in his junior year studying social work and urban planning, had proposed an even more ambitious project, a leadership development program specifically for young people who'd grown up in integrated community development environments. We've been raised differently, he explained in his presentation to our board. We've grown up understanding that individual success and community health are the same thing. We need to prepare young leaders who can carry this vision forward and adapt it for the next generation. His proposal for the Next Generation Community Leaders Program was approved unanimously. The program would identify young people from integrated development communities around the world, bring them together for intensive training, and then support them in creating new innovations in community development. As I reflected on how far we'd come, I realized that Dad's greatest gift hadn't been the money or even the recognition. It had been the perspective shift, the understanding that what looked like failure to some people was actually success measured by different, more meaningful standards. This perspective was spreading. Business schools were adding courses on integrated community development. Medical schools were teaching about social determinants of health and community-based care. Law schools were exploring community-centered approaches to justice. The University of Chicago had indeed offered me a professorship, and I'd accepted. But rather than traditional classroom teaching, my role was to coordinate field experiences where students from different disciplines worked together on real community challenges. The old model of education, I explained to my first class, treated different fields of study as separate silos. Medicine over here, business over there, social work somewhere else. But communities don't experience problems in isolation. A family's financial stress affects their health, which affects their children's education, which affects the economic vitality of their neighborhood. If we're going to solve complex problems, we need professionals who understand these connections. My students spent semesters embedded in community development projects working alongside residents to identify solutions. A business student might collaborate with a public health student and a social work student to design a program that addressed unemployment, healthcare access, and family stability simultaneously. The results were remarkable. Students were graduating with a fundamentally different understanding of their professions, one that emphasized collaboration, community engagement, and systemic thinking. But the most profound validation of our approach came from an unexpected source: a letter from the President of the United States. The letter, delivered by special courier, informed us that the Chen Community Development Model had been selected as the framework for a new federal initiative, the National Community Resilience Program. The program would invest $500 million over 5 years in communities nationwide, using our integrated approach as the standard. Your work has demonstrated, the letter read, that the most effective way to address complex social challenges is not through bigger government programs, but through smarter integration of existing resources and more meaningful engagement with communities themselves. The announcement was made at the White House, with me, Marcus, Sarah, and several residents from our community in attendance. Standing in the Rose Garden, listening to the president describe our model as the future of American community development, I thought about Dad's funeral and Marcus calling me a failure. That evening at the celebration dinner, Marcus stood to make a toast. 15 years ago, he began, I thought success was about building the tallest building, making the biggest deal, having the most impressive office. I thought my brother was wasting his potential helping people one at a time. I was wrong about a lot of things. He paused, looking around the room filled with community leaders, residents, fellows, and our international colleagues. David didn't just succeed at a different kind of work. He succeeded at a different kind of life. And that success created ripples that are still spreading, still growing, still transforming communities around the world. Dad saw that potential before any of us did. He understood that sometimes the greatest achievements don't look like achievements at all until you step back far enough to see their true scale. As I listened to Marcus, the brother who had once measured me against the most conventional definitions of success, describe our work as transformational, I felt a deep sense of completion. Not because the work was finished, it was just beginning. But because the understanding was complete. Dad's will had revealed more than financial bequests. It had revealed a truth about success, about impact, about the different ways people can build meaningful lives. Some people build with steel and concrete. Others build with relationships and trust. Both kinds of building matter. Both create lasting legacies. The fellowship program had graduated its 5th cohort, and our alumni network now spanned 40 cities across 6 continents. Each graduate was creating their own version of integrated community development, adapted to local needs, resources, and cultures. Dr. Jennifer Kim had established the Seattle model, which integrated affordable housing with tech job training, recognizing the city's unique economic landscape. Roberto Sanchez had created the Los Angeles Alliance, which combined community organizing with cooperative business development. Similar innovations were emerging from Tokyo to São Paulo to Stockholm. The Global Community Development Alliance now included 120 cities, and the annual summit had become the premier international gathering for practitioners in the field. This year's summit theme was Beyond Integration, the Next Generation of Community Innovation. The keynote speaker was Sofia Rodriguez, now 27 and leading her own research lab focused on technology for community development. In her speech, she talked about growing up in a community where she'd seen firsthand how connected everything was. The lesson of the Chen model isn't just that services should be integrated, she said to the audience of 3,000 practitioners from around the world. It's that life itself is integrated. Success isn't individual, it's communal. Progress isn't about getting ahead, it's about moving forward together. After the summit, I found myself back at Dad's cabin, now serving as a retreat center for Community development leaders. As I sat on the porch overlooking the lake, I opened Dad's journal, one I'd found among his papers and had been reading slowly over the past year. In one entry dated just a month before his death, he'd written, "David will probably never know the full impact of his work. That's the nature of his approach. He plants seeds without expecting to see the full harvest. But I've seen enough to know that his way of measuring success is not just valid, it's necessary. The world needs people who understand that true wealth isn't accumulated, it's shared. True success isn't achieved alone, it's created together." Reading those words, I finally understood Dad's greatest gift to me. It wasn't the money, though that had made so much possible. It wasn't even the validation, though that had meant everything. His greatest gift was teaching me, through his letter, through his documentation of my work, through his vision for the foundation, that success isn't about proving yourself to others. Success is about improving the world for others. And when you do that, recognition follows naturally. Resources flow more easily, and impact compounds in ways you never imagined possible. As I closed the journal and prepared to head back to the city, I thought about Marcus's words at the celebration dinner. Dad saw that potential before any of us did. But I realized Dad had done more than see potential. He'd created conditions for that potential to flourish. He'd provided resources, but more importantly, he'd provided permission. Permission to measure success differently, to value impact over income, to believe that helping people wasn't just worthwhile work, it was transformative work. The brother who once called me a failure was now my closest collaborator in the largest community development initiative in American history. The father who I'd thought disapproved of my choices had actually been documenting their impact and planning to scale them beyond my wildest dreams. The man who'd been called a failure at his father's funeral had discovered that failure and success were often just different perspectives on the same life, and perspective makes all the difference. As I drove back through the Lincoln neighborhood, that evening, I saw children playing in parks that hadn't existed 2 years ago, families gathering on porches of homes they owned instead of rented, small businesses thriving along streets that had once been marked by empty storefronts. I saw a community that had been built not just with bricks and mortar, but with relationships and trust, with integrated services and shared resources, with the understanding that individual success and collective well-being were not separate goals, but manifestations of the same vision. And I saw the future. A future where communities around the world were discovering that the old definitions of success and failure were too narrow, too limiting, too disconnected from what actually makes life meaningful. That night, as I updated my own journal, I wrote, "Dad's will revealed the truth about failure and success. Failure isn't about having less money or a smaller house or a more modest lifestyle. Failure is about having less impact, creating less value, leaving the world unchanged. Success isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you contribute. And when you measure success that way, even the smallest actions can have the most profound impact." The story that began with a brother calling me a failure at our father's funeral had become a story about redefining success itself, about the power of integration, about the ripple effects of choosing purpose over profit. But mostly, it had become a story about understanding that sometimes the greatest achievements don't look like achievements at all, until you see them from the right perspective, until you measure them by the right standards, until you understand that building communities is just as valuable as building enterprises, that preventing crises is just as important as managing them, that helping others succeed is the truest form of success for yourself. 3 years had passed since that devastating moment at Dad's funeral, and now I stood in the same cemetery under different circumstances entirely. This time, I wasn't burying a parent. I was dedicating a memorial garden that had become the heart of something extraordinary. The Robert Chen Memorial Community Campus, a living testament to his vision of integrated community development. The campus sprawled across 12 acres that had once been abandoned industrial land. What stood before us now defied every traditional category. It was part university, part innovation hub, part community center, part social services campus, and part research laboratory. But calling it any one thing missed the point entirely. It was integration made manifest, the physical embodiment of everything Dad had envisioned when he saw potential in my failure. The dedication ceremony drew speakers from around the world. The mayor of São Paulo described how their adaptation of our model had reduced urban violence by 45% in target neighborhoods. The Director General of the UN Human Settlements Program spoke about how integrated community development was being recognized as essential for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The CEO of a major tech company explained how their corporate social responsibility programs had shifted from charity to partnership after studying our approach. But the speech that moved me most came from an unexpected source: Dr. Michael Thompson, James Thompson's son. James, the veteran whose life I'd helped turn around 15 years ago, had passed away the previous year. Michael had followed his father's example, becoming a social entrepreneur, but he'd taken a different path. My father used to say that David Chen saved his life, Michael began, his voice carrying across the crowd of nearly 1,000 people, gathered in the memorial garden. But what my father really meant was that David showed him how to rebuild his life, not just for himself, but for others. That distinction matters, because it's the difference between rescue and empowerment. Michael had founded VetCorps, a program that trained military veterans in community development work, specifically focusing on post-conflict zones and struggling urban areas. The program had deployed teams to Detroit, New Orleans, Camden, and internationally to cities recovering from conflict or natural disasters. The results had been remarkable. Veterans found new purpose, communities found new hope, and both were transformed in the process. The Chen model taught us that healing isn't individual, Michael continued. Whether you're a veteran dealing with trauma or a neighborhood dealing with disinvestment, recovery happens through connection, through integration, through understanding that your well-being and the well-being of others are inseparable. As I listened to Michael speak, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The memorial campus represented more than just our success. It represented a fundamental shift in how people thought about community, about success, about the relationship between individual achievement and collective well-being. The campus included the Chen Institute, now a fully accredited graduate school offering master's degrees in integrated community development. Our first graduating class of 50 students had come from 22 countries and were now implementing innovations in communities from rural Alabama to urban Ghana to post-industrial northern England. The Research Center for Community Innovation housed teams working on everything from predictive analytics for preventing family crises to blockchain systems for community resource sharing to virtual reality tools for training empathy and service providers. The work emerging from these labs was reshaping not just social services, but urban planning, public health, education, and economic development. The Community Innovation Incubator supported local entrepreneurs developing solutions to neighborhood challenges. These weren't traditional startups seeking venture capital funding, but community-based enterprises designed to strengthen local economies while addressing social needs. A cooperative grocery store that also provided nutrition education and job training. A bike-sharing program that employed formerly homeless individuals as maintenance staff and community liaisons. A urban farm that supplied local restaurants while offering therapeutic programs for people in recovery. Perhaps most importantly, the campus community consisted of mixed-income housing where graduate students lived alongside longtime community residents, where researchers worked in partnership with neighbors, where the barriers between service providers and service recipients had been intentionally blurred. The campus isn't just a place where we study communities, explained Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had left Columbia to become our first Dean of Academic Affairs. It's a community itself, designed to embody the principles we're trying to understand and share. This integration of education, research, service delivery, and community life had created something unprecedented in higher education. Students didn't just learn theories about community development, they lived them. Residents weren't just recipients of services, they were co-creators of solutions. The success of the campus had attracted attention from foundations, government agencies, and corporations interested in supporting what was being called the new paradigm in social innovation. Microsoft had provided $50 million to support our technology initiatives. The Gates Foundation was funding our global expansion. The European Union had adapted our community development framework for their urban renewal programs. But perhaps the most meaningful partnership had come from an unexpected source: Marcus's children. My nephew Jake, now 18, had spent his summers working in various community development programs since he was 14. He'd seen firsthand how integration worked, how small interventions could prevent major crises, how community members could become community leaders when given the right support. "Uncle David," he'd said to me during his high school graduation party, "I want to study engineering, but I want to study it here. I want to design buildings that build communities, not just buildings that house people." His sister Emma, 16, had started a youth leadership program that connected teenagers from our community with peers from other integrated development sites around the world. Through virtual exchanges and annual summits, young people were sharing innovations, collaborating on projects, and building a global network of community-minded leaders. "What's exciting," Emma told a reporter interviewing her about the youth program, "is that our generation doesn't see community development as separate from other careers. We see it as part of everything, part of how you practice medicine, how you run a business, how you design technology, how you create art. It's not a field, it's a perspective." This perspective was spreading in ways that continuously amazed me. The Harvard Business School had created a required course on stakeholder capitalism and community integration, based largely on our research. Medical schools were incorporating community wellness into their curricula alongside traditional clinical training. Architecture programs were requiring students to spend semesters in integrated development communities, learning to design not just buildings but communal spaces. The private sector had taken notice as well. A growing number of companies were relocating operations to integrated development communities, drawn by the educated workforce, stable neighborhood conditions, and innovative business environment. But these weren't traditional industrial relocations. They were partnerships designed to strengthen both the companies and the communities. Chen Construction had pioneered this approach, moving their headquarters to the Lincoln neighborhood and hiring 40% of their workforce from the local community. Productivity had increased 25%. Employee satisfaction was at an all-time high, and their sick leave usage had dropped significantly. A change attributed to both the community-based wellness programs and the reduced stress of shorter commutes and stronger social connections. Other companies had followed suit. A renewable energy company had established their research and development lab on the campus, collaborating with our engineers and employing community members in both technical and support roles. A food tech startup had launched from our incubator and now operated a large-scale urban farming facility that supplied both the local community and restaurants throughout the city. The economic impact had been profound, but also carefully managed. Property values had increased, but through community land trusts and cooperative ownership models, longtime residents were benefiting from the appreciation rather than being displaced by it. New businesses were opening, but community benefit agreements ensured that jobs and services remained accessible to existing residents. "What we've learned," explained Dr. Sarah Chen, who had taken my last name after we married 2 years earlier, "is that economic development and social development aren't competing priorities. When done thoughtfully, they reinforce each other." Sarah had left her teaching position to lead the Community Engagement Institute, a department of the campus dedicated to ensuring that community voice remained central to all our programs. Under her leadership, we'd developed new models for participatory research, community-controlled evaluation, and resident-led innovation. One of her most successful innovations was the Community Wisdom Council, a body consisting entirely of long-time residents who reviewed all campus programs and research projects to ensure they aligned with community priorities and values. The council had the authority to modify or even veto academic research projects, a level of community control that was virtually unprecedented in university settings. The traditional model treats communities as laboratories, Sarah explained, to a delegation of university administrators interested in replicating our approach. Our model treats communities as partners. The knowledge flows both ways, and the decision-making power is shared. This partnership approach had led to research, breakthroughs that neither academic researchers nor community members could have achieved alone. A study on family financial stability had discovered that traditional economic indicators missed crucial community-based resources that families relied on. A research project on educational outcomes had revealed that academic success was more closely tied to community cohesion than to per-pupil spending. International delegations visited monthly, eager to understand how to adapt our model to their own contexts. But what they often discovered was that successful adaptation required more than copying programs. It required embracing a fundamentally different philosophy about human potential, community strength, and the nature of success itself. The African Urban Development Alliance had been particularly innovative in their adaptation. Cities like Kigali, Accra, and Cape Town had created integrated development districts that combined traditional African communalism with modern technological and social innovations. The results had been remarkable: decreased rural to urban migration, increased local economic activity, improved health and education outcomes. The Chen model validated what we already knew in African cultures, explained Dr. Amina Cohn, who led the alliance. Individual success and community well-being are not separate. Ubuntu, the understanding that I am because we are, is a foundational principle of integrated development. Similarly, Scandinavian countries had adapted our approach to enhance their already robust social services. Swedish cities had created innovation districts where citizen participation in program design was mandatory, not optional. Danish cooperatives had evolved to include social services alongside traditional economic activities. Norwegian communities had pioneered future councils, where decisions were made based on projected impacts 7 generations ahead. What's remarkable about the Chen approach, noted Dr. Lars Andersen from the Nordic Institute for Community Innovation, is how it transcends political ideologies. Whether you believe in market solutions or government intervention, the integrated model works because it's about effectiveness, not ideology. This bipartisan appeal had been crucial to our expansion within the United States. Republican governors had embraced the model's emphasis on community self-reliance and private-public partnerships. Democratic mayors had championed its focus on equity and social justice. The result was that integrated community development was becoming policy in diverse political environments. The National Community Resilience Program, now in its 3rd year, had designated 50 communities as pilot sites for intensive integrated development. Early results were exceeding all projections. Crime rates down an average of 35%, high school graduation rates up 40%, new business creation up 200%, families achieving self-sufficiency up 180%. Perhaps most significantly, the program was creating a new generation of community development professionals. The Chen Institute alone had graduated 300 master's students who were now leading programs in all 50 states and 25 countries. But beyond formal education, our model was inspiring people in all walks of life to think differently about their role in community building. Teachers were integrating community engagement into their lesson plans. Doctors were prescribing social connections alongside medications. Business owners were measuring success by community impact as well as profit margins. Local government officials were redesigning services around integration rather than specialization. The memorial garden where we stood for the dedication ceremony had become a symbol of this transformation. Designed by Sofia Rodriguez in collaboration with community members, it wasn't just a memorial to Dad. It was a living laboratory for urban ecology, a gathering space for community events, a therapeutic garden for mental health programs, and an educational site for studying sustainable design. This garden, Sophia explained during the dedication ceremony, represents everything Mr. Chen understood about success. It's not separate from the community around it. It's integrated into it. It doesn't just look beautiful. It serves multiple purposes. It doesn't just honor the past. It nurtures the future. As the ceremony concluded and people began to mingle, in the garden, I found myself surrounded by a constellation of lives that had been touched, directly or indirectly, by the journey that began with Marcus calling me a failure. Maria Santos was there with her daughter, who had just been accepted to medical school and planned to specialize in community health. Marcus Williams Jr., now Dr. Marcus Williams Jr., had brought his team from the community development program he directed in Baltimore. Carmen Torres had come with her husband and children, celebrating the opening of her second health clinic. But it wasn't just the success stories that filled the garden. There were current residents of our community, including families who were still working their way toward stability, students who were still figuring out their paths, immigrants who were still learning the language and navigating new systems. This mix of established successes and works in progress, of community veterans and newcomers, of residents and researchers and visitors from around the world, embodied the core truth that Dad's will had revealed. Success isn't a destination you reach. It's a process you engage in, and it's most meaningful when it's shared. As the sun set over the memorial garden, casting long shadows through the carefully planned landscape, I thought about the irony of standing in a place dedicated to my father's memory while surrounded by the fruits of work he had once seemed to view with puzzlement. But that irony itself revealed a deeper truth. Dad's apparent disapproval had never been about the work itself, but about the narrow definitions of success that dominated his generation's thinking. When he finally understood that my modest salary and simple lifestyle weren't signs of failure but evidence of different priorities, everything changed. His will hadn't just provided resources, it had provided permission. Permission to measure success differently, to value impact over income, to believe that building communities was as important as building businesses. That permission had rippled outward, touching thousands of lives directly and millions more indirectly. It had changed how universities thought about education, how governments approached social programs, how businesses measured value, how communities viewed their own potential. Marcus approached as the crowd began to thin, his own children in tow. At 22 and 19, Jake and Emma had grown up with a fundamentally different understanding of success than either Marcus or I had at their age. They'd seen firsthand that individual achievement and community well-being weren't competing values but complementary aspects of a life well lived. Dad would be proud, Marcus said, looking around the garden and then at the campus beyond. Not just of the success, but of how the success has been shared. He would be amazed, I replied, not just by what we've accomplished, but by how many people have been part of accomplishing it. That perhaps was the most important lesson of our journey, that the greatest successes aren't individual achievements but collective ones, that the most meaningful progress comes not from getting ahead, but from bringing others along, that the truest failure isn't falling short of conventional expectations, but failing to recognize and develop human potential wherever you find it. As Sarah and I walked home through the community that evening, we passed families on porches, kids playing in parks, small businesses preparing for the next day, neighbors helping neighbors with groceries or homework, or just conversation. was a scene that could be found in thousands of communities around the world now, places where the principles Dad had recognized in my work had taken root and flourished. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked as we paused to wave at the Chen family, our neighbors, no relation, who were tending their community garden plot. "I'm thinking about perspective," I said. "About how Dad's will forced everyone, me, Marcus, our whole family, to see my work from a different angle, and how changing perspective on one person's life has somehow changed perspectives on thousands of lives." "And now?" she asked. "Now I'm thinking about the kids who are growing up in these communities, who will inherit a world where integrated development is normal, where measuring success by community impact is expected, where the idea of separating individual achievement from collective well-being seems as outdated as the idea of separating social services from housing, from education, from economic development." We reached our house, a modest place by choice, but comfortable and filled with light and warmth, and I found myself thinking once more about that moment at Dad's funeral when Marcus had called me a failure. In the conventional sense, he'd been right. I had failed to accumulate wealth, to build an impressive career, to achieve the markers of success that our family valued. But Dad's will had revealed a different truth, that there are many ways to define failure and success, many ways to measure a life well lived. I had chosen purpose over profit, impact over income, community building over personal advancement. Those choices had looked like failure to some, but they had created ripples that were still spreading, still growing, still transforming communities and lives around the world. The Chen model was now being studied in business schools and social work programs, implemented by governments and corporations, adapted by communities from São Paulo to Stockholm to Singapore. The integrated approach to community development had become a global movement, one that was reshaping not just how we address social problems, but how we think about human potential and community strength. But perhaps most importantly, it had changed the conversation about success itself. A new generation was growing up understanding that building wealth and building communities weren't competing goals, that helping others succeed was the highest form of personal success, that the old definitions of achievement were too narrow to capture what really mattered in life. That night, as I sat in Dad's study, now my office, updating the Foundation's annual report, I came across a letter that had arrived that day from a community in rural Kenya. They had adapted our integrated development model to address the unique challenges of their region, combining agricultural innovation with educational programs, health services with cooperative economics, environmental sustainability with cultural preservation. The Chen approach taught us that poverty is not about lack of resources, the letter read, but about lack of connection between services, between people, between present needs and future possibilities. By creating these connections, we haven't just improved individual lives, we've strengthened our entire community. As I filed the letter with hundreds of others like it, I thought about Dad's original documentation of the families I'd helped. He'd seen something in that work that I hadn't seen myself, the potential for small-scale, relationship-based intervention, to become a model for large-scale systemic change. His will had been more than a distribution of assets. It had been a vision statement, a confirmation that success measured by impact was not just valid, but valuable, not just admirable, but essential for creating the kind of world where everyone had the opportunity to thrive. Marcus had called me a failure because I didn't fit his definition of success. But Dad's will revealed that the real failure would have been accepting those narrow definitions, settling for conventional measures of achievement, choosing personal advancement over community building. The journey from that moment in the cemetery to this moment in the study had taught me that sometimes what looks like failure is actually success waiting to be recognized, that sometimes the greatest achievements don't announce themselves with fanfare, but reveal themselves through their lasting impact on others. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I paused at the window overlooking the community. Streetlights illuminated safe sidewalks where people walked without fear, House lights revealed families gathering around dinner tables, children doing homework, neighbors visiting with each other. In the distance, the campus glowed softly, its research labs and classrooms and community centers humming with activity even at this late hour. This was Dad's true legacy. Not the money he'd left behind, but the understanding he'd provided. That success isn't about reaching the top alone, but about lifting others as you climb. That wealth isn't about what you accumulate, but about what you contribute. That the greatest achievements aren't individual accomplishments, but collective transformations. The brother who once called me a failure at our father's funeral had become my closest collaborator in building something neither of us could have imagined alone. The modest social worker who'd been dismissed as lacking ambition had created a global movement that was reshaping how societies approached community development. But most importantly, the son who'd thought he'd disappointed his father had discovered that love sometimes expresses itself not through immediate approval, but through patient understanding, careful observation, and ultimately, profound validation of choices that initially seemed incomprehensible. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I thought once more about the will reading, about the moment when everything I thought I knew about Dad's opinion of my work was turned upside down. That moment had been a gift, not just the money, though. That had made so much possible, but the knowledge that my father had seen value in my choices, even when I couldn't see it myself. The greatest inheritance Dad had left wasn't financial, it was philosophical. The understanding that failure and success are often just different perspectives on the same life, that the work of building communities is as valuable as any other form of construction, that sometimes the most important achievements happen not in boardrooms or corner offices, but in living rooms and community centers, in one-on-one conversations and neighborhood gatherings, in the patient work of helping people recognize and develop their own potential. Dad's will had revealed the truth that would reshape not just my life, but thousands of lives around the world. That success isn't about proving yourself to others, but about improving the world for others. And when you dedicate your life to that kind of success, recognition follows, resources flow, and impact compounds in ways you never imagined possible. The man who'd been called a failure at his father's funeral had learned that the greatest success comes not from avoiding failure, but from redefining it, and in doing so, had created a model for community development that was transforming how the world thought about individual achievement, collective well-being, and the true meaning of a life well lived. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.